Good morning. It is Sunday morning. We are so glad that you are tuned in. Our scripture reading this morning will come from the book of 1 Samuel, and we are going to look at a few chapters, but in essence, chapter 21 and 22. And we'll be looking at an episode in the life of King David, the man that was one of the greatest kings of the Bible. What we are going to discover is something that is relevant to all of us, especially in this time of job uncertainty and all the challenges that come with the COVID pandemic. What we see so clearly is that the ways of God are most unappealing and seemingly irrelevant when we are angry, isolated, or afraid. However, you are going to define it, but these three things have the potential to undermine the resolve of even the most dedicated and disciplined person among us. Once a wise man was traveling by foot, and as they passed a small stream, he asked one of his disciples to fetch him some water. The man went to the river, but when he reached it, some animals were passing by, rippling the water and making it muddy. So he returned empty-handed and told the reason. After some time, the wise man sent him again, but the water was still muddy. The third time he was sent, and now this time the mud had settled down. So he scooped the clear water from the surface and brought it back. Upon this the wise man remarked, "We are all like the water of this river. When we are angry or upset, the emotions take over. The murkiness must first settle down before we can face the challenges around us." If you are to stand up and say, "I want to tell you about the greatest regret of my life," chances are that it happened during a time when you were under pressure, emotionally unstable, and you did or said something you now regret. And that brings us back to the story of David. He also had a number of regrets. He was very famous for the failure that happened in his 50s. But the one we are going to talk about today takes place when he was in his 20s. This happened when he was still young, and it's a very interesting and dramatic story. You remember David made name for himself when he defeated Goliath to become overnight the most famous person in Israel. Saul was extraordinarily insecure, and he came up with a plan. He decided to get David into his family so he could control him. That was his desire always. And he offered one of his daughters to David in marriage. But David's response was very interesting. He said in 1 Samuel 18 verse 23, as he was on the run, he said, they repeated these words to David, but David said, "Do you think it's a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known." Remember, in those days, fathers arranged the marriages. And so David refused the king's offer to be his son-in-law. And then the people said, "This young man is absolutely amazing. Who would refuse such an offer?" Well, time goes by and Saul is continuing to look for ways to control David. After some time, David falls in love with one of Saul's other daughters named Michal, and is very pleased about it. And after their marriage, he becomes friends with Saul's son, Jonathan. Now 7 years goes by, and throughout the 7 years, David is in and out of King Saul's favor. Now Saul was determined to get rid of David, but he thought the Philistines will do it for him. So he would send David on these impossible missions. And David would every time come back more successful and gaining more respect. Chapter 18 verse 30 says, "The Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known." This was the story of his life, and everything boiled over one night at dinner. Now, as you know, dinner was the big meal of the day in ancient times. And if you sat or ate at the king's table, that was an extraordinary honor. One night at dinner, the whole family is gathered and David is not there. And King Saul just explodes. And here's what the text tells us. He says in chapter 20, verse 30, Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan. "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman." Now let me stop there for a moment. I hope that perverse and rebellious woman wasn't sitting at the table. You can clearly see there were some marriage issues here, and it's so explainable. You can't be at peace with others if you're not at peace with yourself. Now, back in those days, marriage issues surfaced often because they often had more than one wife. And they also had like favorite wives. But Saul said to him in verse 31, as long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. He must die. So Saul saw Jonathan as the next king, and he wanted his legacy to last. So David must die, and Jonathan then warned David to leave, because he said, my father is not going to rest until you are dead. And all of a sudden, and this is the point of our story this morning, all of a sudden, David experienced the most dangerous time in any person's life. He's afraid for his life. He's alone. He's been rejected by the man that he risked his life for over and over. He must flee from the nation that he risked his life for over and over. And what is worse, in this particular case, he had done nothing wrong. This is the time when you can make serious mistakes, because when we are abandoned, angry, afraid, we panic, and we tend to take matters into our own hands. David lost sight of something that's hard for us to imagine. He lost sight of the fact that God promised him many things and that God was with him right there. When you read it, we think, David, why would you do that? Why would you, of all people, panic? Why would you, of all people, run? God proved to you so many things. He was with you. However, let's make no mistake. We struggle with some of the things in life. In fact, maybe you can look back on a season in your own life that you did the same thing. Today you ask yourself, why did I do that? Why did I go there? Why did I call him back? Why did I say yes to that invitation? Why did I borrow that money? Why did I run away? It's real simple. When you feel abandoned, angry, when you're afraid, our natural inclination is to panic. And that's what David did. And the more intense the emotions, the more your body's fight or flight response kicked in. That's why we so often hear the phrase, blinded by love, paralyzed by fear, or ill with stress. When this happens, we are prone to making poor decisions. Now, chapter 21, verse 1 tells us, David went to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, why are you alone? Why is no one with you? David answered, the king sent me on a mission and said to me, no one is to know anything about the mission I'm sending you on. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. So David went to Nob. In this time of history, the Ark of the Covenant would be moved around from city to city. And at this particular time, it was in the city named Nob, because the tabernacle was there, the priests were there also. So when David shows up, Ahimelech met him and asked him, why are you alone? Previously, every time David showed up, he was in charge of soldiers. And now he suddenly shows up and he's a little nervous and all by himself. So he's asking himself, what is going on here? And David answered him in verse 2. But you see, he lies. Now, why would somebody like David, who killed a giant, why would he lie to a priest? Well, the answer is simple. Because he's afraid. When you're afraid and angry and when you feel isolated, you will do things you normally will never do. David is already rejected. Now he's afraid that if he tells the truth, Ahimelech isn't going to help him at all. What I want you to notice is that this lie would cost not only David, but even more dearly to Ahimelech and his entire family. The story continues. David asked Ahimelech, what do you have on hand? Give me some bread or whatever you can find. I'm hungry. Again, Ahimelech is thinking, you're by yourself, you're hungry, you are the king's son-in-law, the captain of the bodyguard, and here you show up without any food because you're on a secret mission from the king. It doesn't make sense. But he answered David, I don't have any ordinary bread. However, there is some consecrated bread here. Now every Sabbath, the priest would bake very fresh bread and they would put it on the altar before the Lord. It was considered consecrated bread, which meant you had to be ceremonially clean to eat the bread. So Ahimelech says, well, David, we don't have like normal food here because you know we are the high priest. But we have consecrated bread. And if you want the consecrated bread, you can have it. So the priest gave him what belongs to God, consecrated bread. And now David doesn't only lied about why he's there, now he's lied in order to be fed. You begin to wonder what happened to David. And then the story gets so intense, and I'm hoping that in the drama of this next moment, that maybe God would speak to you. David asked him in verse 8, don't you have a spear or a sword here? I haven't brought my sword or any other weapon because the king's mission was urgent. This is when something that is so amazing happens, and David is virtually transported back in the time to the very event God used to catapult him into fame. This is the wake-up call moment. The oh my, what am I thinking? Why am I doing this? This was the moment when his eyes should have been opened. You see, he's asking for a sword, and the priest replied in verse 9, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. It's wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There's no sword here, but that one. David said, there's none like it. Give it to me. Amazing. You see, I need a sword, but the only weapon that's here is the weapon that you used to kill Goliath, the day you became the David that we all know, the one that we love and fear. The commentators tell us that when David beheaded Goliath, he put the sword in his tent, but later, out of gratitude to God, he took it and he dedicated it to God. That's why it was here with the priests. Basically, it was his way of saying, God, I recognize that I did not deliver myself with this weapon. You are the one that delivered me. So I want to give back to you this weapon as a reminder that I am dependent on you. You see, there was so much emotion here, so much significance to the sword of Goliath. Suddenly David is reminded of that afternoon that he did the unthinkable. When Ahimelech brought out that sword, all the memories came flooding back. How he as a shepherd boy, with nothing but a sling, with thousands of men lined up on both sides of the valley, how he ran towards a giant. How he as a God-fearing shepherd boy looked at a giant, the battle-hardened warrior. How he said, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, in the name of the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied, and this day I'm going to strike you down. I'm going to take your head from you. I'm going to feed all the carcasses of the host of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the field, so that the whole world will know there is a God in Israel, and everyone will know that it's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. What a marvelous statement of faith. How he was running towards the enemy. So the question is, David, what happened now? What happened to the young man that ran toward danger as opposed to being scared, running away from it? David, you wrote these famous words in Psalm 23 verse 4, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Where's that young man? Where's that faith? Where's that confidence in the living God? And the answer is fear, anger, rejection, loneliness. These giants have the potential to cause all of us to forget the defeated giants in our past. These big enemies, giant enemies, have the potential to undermine our faith in God based on what God has done in the past. Here David gets this extraordinary reminder. He's shown a visual aid to remind him of God's faithfulness. You see, the priest replied in verse 9, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, and listen now, whom you killed is here. You see, is wrapped in a cloth. This is the garment that the priests wore when they did their priestly duties. If you want it, take it. And instead of stopping David in his tracks, he takes it. And this would be a decision that David would regret for the rest of his life. It would become a permanent part of the story of his life, just as in our case, our decisions also become part of the story of our lives. David said, "Give it to me. There's none like it." And like the prodigal son, David takes matters literally into his own hands with a sword that was last wielded by a giant who was defeated by a 15-year-old boy. The unthinkable. David should have remembered. It was just too much to miss. But this is where our stories intersect with the story of David. This is where we are when we need God most. When we need God most, we are oftentimes tempted to run away rather than toward. We opt for things that never worked before, didn't get us where we are, and that often leads to our regrets. It is so interesting that we can see this in other people. You have friends right now that are making terrible decisions based on fear and anger, and you are thinking to yourself, you are just going to make it more complicated. Maybe at the work, some people are retrenched, and you are making some strange moves. You are just going to create more regret. It's so easy to see this in other people, but it is almost impossible to see this in the mirror. And here's why. Because you've convinced yourself my situation is different. Maybe David thought what we think. If God were with me, if God were really with me, this wouldn't be happening to me. So David takes Goliath's sword, and then just to show you where this goes, and again, it's easy to be critical of David, because we all have our version of this. David takes Goliath's sword, and guess where he goes? He goes straight to the land of the Philistines. Read it with me. That day, David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to him, "Isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands." You see, it's not a good move to go to the land of the Philistines with Goliath's sword. It gets worse. Not only does he go to the land of the Philistines, he goes to the city of Gath. Guess who was from Gath? That would be Goliath. This is so ridiculous. But he's panicking. He's afraid. And so he goes to the king of the Philistines because he's running away, and he thought that would bring safety. But they recognized him there in verse 11. They said, "No way, you are David. Everybody knows who you are. You slew Goliath, and don't tell us you are not, for you are carrying his own sword." Then David panics even more because now he's surrounded by his enemies. So he pretends like he's insane. Think of this warrior, this hero. Now he pretends he's insane. David was very much afraid, so he pretended to be insane in their presence. And while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. You see, David has come a long way from being the hero who defeated Goliath. See now, he's reduced to pretending to be a madman while drooling on his own beard. And it is all because he took matters in his own hands. He allowed fear and anger and all those terrible emotions to take over. David's behavior, and this I must point out, had serious complications. The day David was with Ahimelech, looking for bread, looking for a weapon, there was someone else there as well, Doeg, the chief herdsman for King Saul. And he saw David, and he overheard the conversations, and he got just enough information to make things really look bad for him. So he goes to Saul. He says to King Saul in chapter 22, verse 9, "I saw the son of Jesse come to Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, at Nob. Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him. He also gave him provisions and the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. So Duke said, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but the chief priest has sided with your enemy. He went to the Lord to get advice for David. He also gave him provisions, and I hate to tell you this, he also gave him the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. So the king is furious. He sent for the priests, and he said to them, why have you conspired against me by giving the son of Jesse bread and a sword and inquiring of God for him? Ahimelech answered, who of all your servants is as loyal as David? What are you talking about? David isn't in rebellion against you. I mean, his reputation in the community is that he's your most loyal subject. Who's more loyal as David, the king's son-in-law, the captain of the king's bodyguard? I mean, you've entrusted this man as your bodyguard, and everybody knows how loyal he is to you, and he's highly respected in your household. Let not the king accuse your servant of any of this, for your servant knows nothing at all about this whole affair. But the king said, you will surely die, Ahimelech, you and your whole family. Then the king ordered the guards to turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because they had sided with David. But his soldiers refused to kill them. They were willing to act against Saul's enemies. They were willing to kill those that have robbed and stolen, but they were not going to kill the priests of the Lord. And Duke saw it as an opportunity to get in good with the king. So let's read verse 18. Duke the Edomite turned and struck them down. That day he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. He also put to the sword Nob, the town of the priests, with its men and women, its children and infants, its cattle, donkeys, and sheep. One person escaped. He tells David the whole story. And David is broken and he says, I am responsible for the death of your entire family. So in conclusion, I want to ask you 2 or 3 questions as we think of how this intersects with our lives. You see, to all of us, there's going to be a time in all of our lives when our reaction pushes us to do things we later discovered, but that was done because I was running away. So here's the question. What is your loneliness or fear causing you to consider that you've never considered before? Relationally, financially, physically? Is it maybe a habit? And with all the uncertainty, suddenly you find yourself rethinking and even embracing that silly habit. What is your loneliness, anger, or fear causing you to consider that you've never considered before? A second question. What is your loneliness or anger or fear causing you to consider that you know you shouldn't consider? Because of what's going on at work, maybe, or what's going on financially, because of what's going on in some other area of your life, suddenly that's a life option. And you know you have no business doing that. And here's the wake-up call question. This is the question that David completely missed, but I hope it will be your wake-up call as well. Who besides you do your considerations put at risk? Who besides you do these questions that were never options before? Who do these options put at risk besides you? And I already know the answer to that question for you. The answer is the people you love the most and the people who love you the most. Some of you know that through personal experience with your own family growing up, because your dad's anger spun out of control. You've been dealing with it ever since mom's depression, or mom's sense of loneliness or abandonment just got out of control and she turned to things and you've been dealing with it ever since. Listen, who else's future hangs in the balance because of your personal decision to give in to the impulses caused by anger, abandonment, or fear? A third question. What advice would you give someone who's thinking, I am the exception to the rule? You see, you are a very unique person, but your experience is not as exceptional. That is something that you and I need to understand. You are a one-of-a-kind person, but your experience is not one of a kind. These are well-traveled paths, and that's why it's so easy to know what other people ought to do. The interesting thing about this question is that we know the advice that David would give us. He would journal it to us. In Psalm 9 verse 9 he says, The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. Listen, the Lord is the refuge for the oppressed. Not alcohol, not an affair, not a lot of debt, not a new car, not something else. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed. Let me explain the word, a refuge, a stronghold. You see, in times of war or in times of trouble, is a stronghold a place you run to? In taking matters into his own hands, David was doing exactly the opposite. He was not running to God. He was running away from him. A minister shared a story that took place on the Sunday after the Titanic sank. It happened in Belfast, where the great ship was built. Naturally, the townspeople were devastated. History tells us men met on the city streets, grasped each other's hands, burst into tears, parted without speaking a word. That minister that Sunday shared about one church that lost 16 men to the icy waters. All were mechanics on the Titanic. On that dark Sunday, the pastor read the scripture from Mark chapter 4, verse 35 and 41. When Jesus calmed the storm, Jesus was asleep, and then he calmed the storm. The minister told his troubled church that only one vessel in all of history had been truly unsinkable, and that wasn't the Titanic. It was the little boat occupied by the sleeping Jesus. And he added, the only hearts that can weather the storms are hearts with Jesus inside. You see, God is the place you run to. He is the relationship you run to when you feel oppressed. David would later say, I thought I'd been forsaken, but I was mistaken. I thought this wouldn't be happening to me if God was with me. I was wrong. God promised me many things, and now, as I'm looking back, all were fulfilled. So if David could speak to us, he would definitely give us this advice. Don't run. Don't run. When Ahimelech brought out the sword of Goliath, that's when I should have remembered. Don't move, for the Lord can do what no man can do. He's a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. But our message for this morning is even better than that. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, but He's your stronghold in these times of trouble. May God bless us.